Okay, ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to you all. Thank you for coming out. What is an exceedingly hot day. I sat in my air-conditioned office most of it, but I heard all about it. My name is Rob Havers, the president of the George C. Marshall Foundation, and welcome to tonight's special event in the year-long Legacy Series sequence dealing with George C. Marshall and the two world wars. No one understood more than General Marshall the old adage that an army is no better than its commanders. He knew that superior logistics, intelligence, training, and resources still could not compensate for inferior or inadequate leadership. As the Army's Chief of Staff during World War II, General Marshall faced the daunting task of choosing the men to command the Army's field forces. He put considerable thought into that process, evaluating each officer's background, education, age, and especially character and suitability before making those selections. The result, a cadre of 38 men who led the Army's major combat units across the Pacific and across Europe and led them to victory. Although several of them failed on the battlefield, the success of the vast majority is testimony to Marshall's knack for identifying and assigning talented officers, assigning them to appropriately matched positions. His ability to do so not only contributed enormously to that Allied victory, but also provided the Army's post-war leadership. Our guest this evening to talk about this topic is Dr. Steve Tafe. Dr. Tafe is a member of the history faculty at the Stephen F. Austin State University in Nacogdoches, Texas. He has written several books, including 3 about aspects of World War II, and one of these books, as you probably well know, is George C. Marshall and his generals, a topic that he will talk to us about this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please welcome Steve Tafe.
I appreciate the opportunity to come back to the Marshall Foundation. My wife and I were here in, I think, 2009, and I can honestly say it was the nicest research trip I've ever had of all the research trips I've ever taken. I like the town. We got to walk around in the evenings, and Paul Barron, who was running the archives at the time, was as nice as could be and as helpful as can be, and it was just a wonderful trip, much better than the National Archives. Nobody yelled at me, and that was a big advantage. And before you start a speech like this, you're always supposed to tell some sort of humorous story or anecdote, even if you don't have much of a sense of humor, which I don't. But you're supposed to do that anyway, so rather than fly in the face of convention, I do have a humorous story. I've been a professor for a long time. I've been a professor much longer than I was ever a student, so sometimes I forget what it's like to be a student. But one of the things I remember about students is they don't like to be around professors because they think professors are pretentious and egotistical, which is true. And I remember a bunch of my history department colleagues and I were going back to our offices after eating lunch, and there were about a half dozen of us or so. And we got into the elevator, and just before the elevator door closed, these 2 students got into the elevator. So there were about a half dozen of us historians and these 2 students, and you could tell that they felt really awkward and uncomfortable in that situation. And the elevator started to go up to whatever floor we were at the time, and suddenly the elevator stopped and it began to shake and shimmy. And everybody stopped talking, and there was this long, pregnant pause, and we're standing there, and the one student turned to the other and said, "These aren't the people I want to die with." So at any rate, what I want to spend about 40 minutes talking about and then 15 minutes or 20 minutes taking questions on is George Marshall and his selection of the Army's high-ranking combat commanders during World War II. And I think it's an important topic, and let me give you a couple reasons why I think it's such an important topic. First reason why is this: an army is no better than its commanders. You can have the greatest weapons in the world, you can have material, you can have the technology, you can have the numbers. It's not not going to matter unless you have great commanders to lead your men. And you see this in World War II. It wouldn't have mattered if the United States had all that material superiority. It wouldn't have mattered unless we had good commanders. So the commanders are important, and that's a reason to look at these guys. Second reason to look at these men is because they influence the course of the war. If you think of the Army as a machine, these are the guys who operated the machinery during the war, and as such, their decisions are going to impact the course of the war in all sorts of ways. And an obvious example, and there are lots of them, would be, say, Mark Clark. In 1944, Mark Clark, who commanded the American Fifth Army in Italy, he made this decision that he was going to try to be the first one into Rome rather than destroy the German army in Italy. And so even though he was able to get into Rome, the German army escaped and was able to fight on for another 10 months. Perhaps if Mark Clark had focused on destroying the German army instead of getting to Rome first, maybe the war in Italy would have ended a little sooner. And there are a whole bunch of generals who made similar decisions like that, and lots of them. And so it's important for that reason. These guys made decisions that impacted the war. And finally, I think the last reason why this is important is because it tells us something not only about George Marshall, but also about the American Army in the mid-1900s. And by this, I mean Marshall and the Army, they strove to produce a certain kind of officer. And I guess the best characteristic, or the best word to describe the kind of officer they wanted to produce, is they're trying to produce a professional officer, okay? A group of officers who all operate from the same playbook, from the same page. And this gives us a good insight into how successful Marshall and the Army was at producing this kind of officer. Tells us something about the Army in the mid-1900s. So I think it's an important topic. I spent 4 years of my life on it, so I assume it's an important topic. All right. I think before we can talk about the criteria that Marshall used to pick his senior commanders, I think I need to talk a little bit about George Marshall and the American Army in World War II. And I think it's important to keep in mind the size of the Army in World War II. In World War II, the Army grew from a force of 175,000 men in 1939 when the war began to a wartime peak of 10.4 million men. 10.4 million servicemen in the war. By comparison, in the Civil War, the Union Army reached a wartime peak of 600,000 men. In World War I, the Army reached a wartime peak of 3.4 million men. And this is important because it enabled the Army to create these giant formations that it had never seen before and has really never seen since. Okay, the Army in World War II was able to create and send overseas 89 combat divisions. A division is a unit of about 15,000 men. They're able to send 89 of these overseas during World War II. And the Army took these 89 combat divisions and it organized them into a unit called a corps. Okay, corps are 2 or more divisions, and during the war there were 20 of these corps. And then the Army took these corps and fielded 8 or 9, depending on how you count them, field armies. A field army being 2 or more of these corps. And the Army grew so big they even had a unit above that called an Army group, which is 2 or more field armies. And the guys who commanded these units, you know, we're talking about men who command groups, organizations of 15,000, 30,000, 100,000, over 1 million for an Army group. So the numbers are huge, and you got to have the right guys available to command them. And the guy who was responsible for, of course, selecting the Corps commanders, the Field Army commanders, the Army group commanders was George Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the American Army in World War II. Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but in my opinion, George Marshall was the second greatest American general in our history. I'd put Washington higher, but other than that, I think George Marshall was the most important general we've had. I think he's more important than Grant, more important than John Pershing, more important than Douglas MacArthur, more important than George Patton. He's just an important guy, the guy who led the United States through the war, the Army through the war, more than anybody else, the architect of American strategy during the war. Here's how Omar Bradley described Marshall. Bradley was one of these Army group commanders. He said, quote, "In the Army, we often scoff at the myth of the indispensable man, for we have always maintained that Arlington Cemetery is filled with indispensable men. General Marshall, however, was an exception, for if ever a man was indispensable in a time of national crisis, he was that man. And there are all sorts of reasons why you can point to George Marshall being one of the great generals in American history, but one of the big ones was because he appointed such a capable group of high-level combat commanders. And I think there are a couple things to keep in mind about Marshall that inform his decision-making process of who to select to command these Army group and field Army and Corps commanders. And let me just give you two that I think are kind of important and tell a lot about him. The first one is this, Marshall's character and personality. Marshall was an admirable man in all sorts of ways. He impressed everyone with his sense of honor, his enormous integrity, his ability to cut to the heart of the matter, his professionalism, his dignity, and more important than anything else, his ability to get things done in an organization like the Army, which sometimes seems designed not to get things done. Marshall's civilian superior in World War II was Secretary of War Henry Stimson, and this is what Stimson wrote about Marshall in his diary. Okay, Stimson wrote, quote, "Marshall towers above everybody else in the strength of his character and in the wisdom and tactfulness of his handling of himself and handling of his plan. He is by far the biggest man that I have ever met in Washington, although as a loyal soldier he does not seek exhibitions of his qualities as a civil character, yet he has them. He is selfless, tactful, careful in his detail work of planning, very conciliatory in negotiations, and yet capable of terrific force in carrying through a decision that he has fully made up his mind about." So he's an admirable guy. Having said that, there was a kind of cold-hearted aspect to Marshall. There was an intimidating aspect to the guy. He came across as a kind of cold-blooded, humorless, ruthless, aloof guy. Almost nobody called him by his first name. He called almost nobody by their first name. The only exception I've read is that Joe Stilwell would call Marshall George, and Douglas MacArthur would call Marshall George. But other than that, everybody called him General Marshall. There's a story once of this up-and-coming young Army officer had to give a presentation to Marshall during World War II, and the guy came in and he just screwed it up. He just blew it, and he was nervous and he was obviously intimidated. And after he left the office, Marshall turned to one of his assistants and said, "Geez, this is supposed to be a first-rate guy. What's his problem?" And Marshall's assistant said, "Geez, General, you scared the guy to death." And that's typical Marshall. He had this sort of austere personality. But the truth was, if you scrape beneath the veneer of George Marshall's aloof and cold-blooded manner, he was actually a rather kind guy, and there are all sorts of stories of Marshall's kindness. When he was returning to his Fort Myers headquarters at the end of the day, he would have his driver stop and pick up soldiers and give them a ride back, which is a nice thing to do. During World War II, he discovered that these soldiers garrisoning Iceland had run out of beer. If there's one thing that's important to soldiers, it's beer. So he arranged for an immediate delivery of 40,000 cases or bottles of beer to Iceland. Another example of Marshall's kindness is during World War II, whenever a high-ranking combat general returned from the front to visit the States, Marshall would insist that the guy spend some time with his wife. He thought that was important. And during World War II, there was a Corps commander. His name was Pete Corlett. He commanded the 19th Corps. And Corlett had been relieved of his command on the border of France and Germany, and his career's obviously going downhill because he lost his command, and he returned to the States. And you might think that Marshall would just not have anything to do with him because he was obviously damaged goods. But when Corlett returned to the States at New York Harbor, there was a car there waiting for him, and there was an officer there, and he said, General Marshall has asked me to take you to the Waldorf Astoria, where Marshall had arranged for Corlett's wife, who lived in Arizona, to fly to New York City and put her up in the Waldorf Astoria so this general, who was again considered damaged goods, would be able to spend some time with his wife, which again strikes me as a kind-hearted thing to do. And my favorite story about how kind Marshall could be is that occasionally there'd be these social gatherings. I guess it was his Fort Myers quarters, and he didn't have them that often, but he did have them. And the neighborhood kids were causing trouble because, there's something going on there. They wanted to see what was going on, and they were interfering and causing trouble. Now, anybody else would have said to the guards, get those kids out of there. But what Marshall did is he took the neighborhood neighborhood kids, got them together, and he organized them into an auxiliary security force so they could help the guards keep an eye on what's going on. Okay, so again, he has this reputation for being this cold-blooded, austere, aloof guy. He really wasn't. He was a kind-hearted man. And the second thing I think to remember about Marshall that sort of informed his leadership style and choosing his commanders is this, how he viewed leadership. I'm not a leader myself. I'm just a follower. I'm a regular history professor. But if I were a leader, okay, I'd take a lesson, a page out of Marshall's playbook. There are some things he did that seem commonsensical, but really are kind of hard to do when it comes to displaying leadership. For example, Marshall understood that he only had so much energy. By World War II, he's in his 60s. There are only so many hours in a day. He only has so much energy. So Marshall left his office almost every night at 6 o'clock, and then he was done. Okay, he'd go to his quarters in Fort Myer, and he would only accept phone calls from the President or the Secretary of War. Okay, and when he returned home, he and his wife, they would go canoeing down the Potomac River, or they'd go to a movie, or they would garden later on in the war, because he understood he only had so much energy. He's done at 6 o'clock, and he figured not much is going to happen that he can really change in an immediate way until next morning. Can you imagine a chief of staff today with that kind of philosophy? We'd think he's nuts. Okay, but in this era before instantaneous communications, that's Marshall's philosophy. Marshall also believed that his job was to make decisions. Okay, he's the chief of staff. He's the guy who should make decisions, and he believed in making them in a timely manner. If you were an officer and you had to go see General Marshall, you had instructions. This is what you were supposed to do. You were supposed to walk into his office and walk directly to his desk and wait for him to finish doing what he was doing, because Marshall believed if you ever put aside a letter, you'd never get back to it. So you had to wait for him to finish his correspondence or whatever he was doing. When he looked up at you, then you got immediately to the point. Okay, you ask him for a decision, you deliver him information, you do it directly, and then you're done. Again, which seems commonsensical, but how many of us can actually do that? So that's a second example. Third example of his leadership style is that Marshall knew enough to surround himself with good men and give them plenty of authority to get the job done. Again, this seems commonsensical, but how often do you hear about a CEO who's overworked because he or she doesn't have the time or energy? Well, Marshall understood if you have good people around you, then you can delegate jobs to them. And to his credit, he never scapegoated these guys. I know whenever I get into trouble, the first thing I do is I try to scapegoat it and blame my department assistant or my graduate assistant or somebody like that. Well, Marshall didn't believe in doing that. Okay, he didn't believe in scapegoating his subordinates. And finally, a last thing that Marshall did, which again seems commonsensical but isn't necessarily, is he tried to eliminate all emotions from his decision-making process. He said that emotions clouded his mind, so sort of like a Vulcan from Star Trek. So he tried to eliminate all emotions from his decision-making process. So as a result, again, because of his personality, because of his character, because of his leadership style, almost everybody respected the guy. Okay, even the British, who didn't like American generals all that much, even the British respected Marshall, respected him as a soldier, even if they didn't necessarily agree with his strategy and stuff like that. All right. So how did Marshall choose his high-ranking commanders? Okay, we have his personality, his character, his leadership style. That informs his process. What's the process he used to choose his high-ranking commanders? Now remember, Marshall was Army Chief of Staff. He wasn't Commander-in-Chief. That's Franklin Roosevelt. But during the war, Franklin Roosevelt pretty much left Marshall alone. Okay, he left Marshall alone to choose whatever commanders he wanted. He didn't interfere. In fact, there's a story of the war of this one general who'd been relieved of his command, and he came to talk to Marshall about it. And at the end of the interview, the general said, "Well, I'm going to go to Franklin Roosevelt." And Marshall just laughed and said, "You can go talk to Franklin Roosevelt if you want, but he's going to laugh you out of the room. But if you want to go talk to Franklin Roosevelt about this, you can do so." So it's really Marshall's call. He's the guy who makes the decision. He's the guy who's going to appoint the guys who led the corps, the field armies, and the army groups. And as far as I can tell, there are 4 criteria he would use, these 4 big criteria that he used to choose these men. The first one is this: an officer's character. In 1944, a group of students from Roanoke, Virginia, they wrote Marshall a letter, and they asked Marshall, "How do you pick your generals?" And Marshall actually wrote him back, and he wrote him back in a way that showed that he'd put a lot of thought into it. And this is what Marshall wrote back to these students. He said, quote, these are 9 to 12-year-olds, by the way. He said, quote, "The most important factor of all is character, which involves integrity, unselfish and devoted purpose, a sturdiness of bearing when everything goes wrong and all are critical, and a willingness to sacrifice self in the interest of the common good." So he believed character was important. He believed the general is no better than his character. As he wrote in a letter to Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander in Europe, he said, quote, "I wasn't so much interested in generals' tactical skills as much as I was in having sturdy, aggressive fighters who would stand up during moments of adversity." So he saw character as important, which might seem commonsensical, but not necessarily. I know that if I'm on a search committee at my university and we're looking for a new history professor and I'm sitting in a room with some people, if I were to say to them, I think we ought to consider a person's character, some of my colleagues would say, oh, no, you can't consider a person's character. That's irrelevant to how he or she performs the job. You see it with politicians all the time. I don't care what his character is or her character is, as long as he or she does the job. Okay, Marshall didn't buy that. Marshall believed that character was fate. Okay, he believed that an officer's character is important. He wouldn't buy that argument that, oh, there have been great generals who have been awful human beings. He wouldn't agree with that. Character is fate to Marshall. Character is more important to Marshall than anything else. And his definition of great character informed his process. All right, so that's one thing Marshall cared about, one criteria. You got to have character. Okay? A second thing that Marshall cared about, a second criteria that he had, is this: education. One of the Army's accomplishments in the early 1900s is that the Army had developed an educational system. Okay, during the Progressive Era in the early 1900s, the Army concluded that an officer's education should be throughout his entire career. It shouldn't stop as soon as you're commissioned from West Point or VMI or the Citadel. No. It should be throughout your entire career. And as part of that process, the Army developed a whole bunch of schools so that officers could be educated throughout their career. And I've read the statistics somewhere that said that something like 1/3 of an officer's career today is spent getting educated at one of the Army schools. And there are a whole bunch of schools that the Army set up, but the two most important were these: the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, and the Army War College in Washington, D.C. The Command and General Staff School is a school, again, it's out in Kansas, and what it is, it's a school for lieutenants and captains to go learn how to be staff officers, how to help the general run the division, the corps, the Army group, to write orders, how much fuel a convoy needed and stuff like that. As for the Army War College, it's a school for lieutenant colonels and colonels, and you go to the Army War College to learn how to command big units. How do you run a division? How do you command a corps and a field army? And those are the two really important ones. Those are the sort of gatekeepers for the officer corps. If you're an up-and-comer, if you're somebody who obviously has a promising career in the Army, you'll go to one of those two schools. And Marshall thought it was important. He thought it was important. If you're going to command a corps, if you're going to command a division or a field army, you ought to have gone to these schools to learn how to do this stuff. In fact, Marshall or his advisors, they usually checked an officer's educational records before making the command decisions because they valued education so much. And in fact, of the 38 men during World War II who commanded Army groups, field armies, or corps, all but 5 of them attended the Army War College. Okay, in fact, of those 38 men, there's only one guy who didn't attend the Army War College or the Command and General Staff School. Only one of those 38. And I'm sure you want to know who the one was. The one guy who didn't go to either school was James Van Fleet. He commanded the 3rd Corps in Europe, and later on he went on to command the 8th Army in Korea. In many respects, he advanced as far as almost any of them did. But he never went to the Command and General Staff School. He never went to the Army War College. Right. But he's the exception that proves the rule. Okay, I should note, though, as a caveat to this, Marshall valued education, but that doesn't mean you had to go to West Point. Okay, you didn't have to be a West Point guy to advance to the top. Marshall, as we know, did not go to West Point. He went to Citadel or someplace like that. So of the 38 men who commanded these high-level units, 9 of them were commissioned directly from the ranks. 2 of them went to other military schools. 1 rose to command a corps from the Oklahoma National Guard. Okay, so he didn't care so much how you became an officer. Okay, it didn't matter whether it's from the ranks, whether it's from VMI, Citadel, West Point. He didn't care. It's what you did with yourself once you were commissioned as an officer. So education was important to him. All right? A third criteria that Marshall used. Okay, he believed in character. He believed in education. He also believed that your birthday was important. Okay, not for an astrological reason, but let me explain. Okay, Marshall had served as a staff officer under John Pershing in World War I. And one of the things he encountered there were these old officers who clearly were not physically fit enough to command their large units. And he really remembered that. Okay, you got these guys who were in their 60s, they hadn't had a lot of education, and he remembered that so many of them broke down under the stress of operations in France in World War I. And he didn't want that same thing to happen in World War II. So as soon as he became chief of staff in 1939, he began this process to try to weed out officers he thought were too old and give those jobs, commanding divisions and corps and field armies, to younger men. Here's how he explained it to one guy who he relieved of command because the guy Marshall thought was too old. He said, quote, "We have had to be absolutely firm on the question of age for command. Not only that, but we must go much lower in the age groups for division and corps commanders than we are now doing. Every bit of data we receive from the fighting front shows clearly that this is a young man's war, except in rare instances, and then only in the highest of command." Okay, during World War II, the average age of those 38 men who led the army groups, field armies, and corps, the average age at the beginning of the war for us in 1941 was in their early 50s. By the way, the oldest guy at the beginning of the war was Walter Kruger. He commanded the 6th Army in the Pacific. He was 60, and the only reason why he went overseas is because Douglas MacArthur asked for him. The youngest guy of these 38 was Joe Collins, who commanded the 7th Corps in Northwest Europe. He was 45. Okay, but again, the average age, about the early 50s, probably not quite as young as Marshall wanted. He was always complaining, we got to get more of the deadwood out of the way, but not that bad. All right, so your age was important. There's one story of Marshall had a bunch of these generals in a room, and there were guys who were a little bit over the hill, and he just looked at them and he said, "You guys are all too old to command." Just said it straight like that. And I know this because there's the memoirs of one of those guys who did end up commanding the division, so it was his way of explaining how he overcame George Marshall. All right, but that's a third thing that's important. Okay, so you got their birthday, you have the education, you have their character, and there's one last thing that's important, one last, I guess, criteria that Marshall used, and that's this. Okay, he had to know you or know somebody who knew you. Okay, there's this old saying in an organization that it doesn't matter how good you are. If nobody knows you're good, it's not going to matter. Okay, people got to be aware that you're doing a good job. So generally speaking, you couldn't rise to the highest combat levels. You couldn't command a corps or a field army or an army group unless you had attracted Marshall's attention or the attention of somebody who had Marshall's ear, somebody that Marshall had confidence in. Okay, Marshall kept track of a lot of his officers, although I guess it's a myth that he had a black book. He did keep track of officers and how they did. He noticed people. That's why so many of these high-ranking guys were Marshall men. Okay, guys like Dwight Eisenhower was a Marshall pro, Courtney Hodges, J. Lawton Collins, Matthew Ridgway. They all had come across Marshall at some point, often at Fort Benning when Marshall was assistant commandant there at the infantry school. And he remembered these guys, and of course when the war came around, he's going to make sure that they get good commands because he remembered them and they impressed him. But not even Marshall could know everyone. Okay, so as the war went on, he's going to increasingly rely on the opinions of others, particularly his theater commanders, for their opinions. And how much he relies on them depended on the person. For example, Marshall and Eisenhower had a good, close relationship. Again, Eisenhower was a Marshall protege, and they would consult extensively about who should command such and such a unit. And in fact, Marshall's confidence in Eisenhower grew and grew and grew, so by the end of the war, Marshall gave Eisenhower virtual carte blanche. You know, whoever you want to bring over, whoever you want to appoint to command these units, that's fine with me. In other theaters, it was less of a an informal relationship. Marshall and Douglas MacArthur, for example, had I don't want to say a frostier relationship, but a more formal relationship, so you don't have the give and take, that sort of thing. But, well, here's how Marshall explained it to Eisenhower. He said, quote, "You do not need to take or keep any commander in whom you do not have full confidence. So long as he holds a command in your theater, it is evidence to me of your satisfaction with him. The lives of too many are at stake. I will not have you operating under any misunderstanding as to your authority and your duty to reject or remove any that fails to satisfy you completely." All right? And a good example would be Leonard Jareau. He was a commander of a corps, the 5th Corps, who was slated to land at D-Day at Omaha Beach was his responsibility. And Marshall had his doubts about Jareau. Jareau hadn't lived up to Marshall's expectations earlier in the war, but Eisenhower loved the guy. Eisenhower considered Jareau like his brother, Jareau, a VMI guy, and Eisenhower went to bat for him and told Marshall, "I really want this guy," and Marshall gave way because he had that kind of confidence in Eisenhower. Okay, so again, if you want to rise to the high levels, you either got to have Marshall's ear or you got to have the ear of somebody Marshall respected, like a guy like Dwight Eisenhower. All right, so that's 4 criteria that I found in my research that Marshall used. Now, having said this, there were certain things that you would think Marshall would care about, but he didn't. Okay, things that you would think, well, of course, if you're going to appoint a corps commander or an army group commander, you ought to care about, but he didn't. And let me give you 4. Okay, 4 that he should have cared, well, not should have, but might have cared about, but he didn't. All right, the first one is this: your background. Okay, Marshall didn't care. He didn't care about your background. Now, to be sure, the Army's institutionalized racism and sexism at the time limited the officer pool to white guys. Okay, but within that parameter, okay, Marshall didn't care. He didn't care about your nationality. He didn't care about your ethnicity. None of that stuff mattered. Okay, during the war, somebody wrote a letter to Marshall complaining about a general who'd been appointed to some high-level position who was of German heritage. And Marshall responded by saying, quote, "It is nothing remarkable to have a high-ranking officer in our Army who is of German stock." And so he didn't care about your ethnicity. He didn't care about your nationality. Didn't matter to him. All right? A second thing he didn't care about is this. He didn't care about your position in the Army's cliques and factions and branches. Didn't matter to him. Okay, the Army, like any big organization, is full of all sorts of cliques and factions. Okay, it has different branches, armor, engineering, artillery, that sort of thing. But there's no evidence that Marshall really cared that much about what branch you came from, what clique you're from, what faction you're in, as long as he thought you could do the job. And let me give you an example. There's a corps commander in World War II. His name was John Milliken. John Milliken commanded the 3rd Corps in Northwest Europe for a while. And Milliken's father-in-law was a man named Patton March. Patton March had been the chief of staff during World War I. And Patton March and John Pershing, who commanded American troops over in France in World War I, they had an antagonistic relationship. And of course, Marshall, as a Pershing protege, you would think that he might resent Milliken because Milliken was close to Patton March through marriage, but there's no evidence that he did. There's no evidence that he cared. And again, Milliken was able to rise to become a corps commander during World War II. Okay, so he didn't care about your position in the cliques and the factions and the branches. Didn't seem to matter to him. All right? A third thing that Marshall didn't care about, which you think he would, is this: your combat experience. Okay, Marshall didn't care if you didn't have a lot of combat experience. A lot of high-ranking guys like Eisenhower did, but Marshall didn't care. Indeed, he selected a number of men to high-ranking combat commands in World War II who had never heard a shot fired in anger before the war. Hey, people forget, Dwight Eisenhower, until World War II, he'd never been in combat before and never heard a shot fired in anger. Same with Omar Bradley. Same with J. Lawton Collins. I think Ridgway was the same too. Okay, it didn't matter to Marshall if you hadn't seen action before. And even after the war began and the Army started to accumulate these battle-hardened guys, Marshall still didn't care, and I have an example of that. In 1944, the Army set up a new field army called the 10th Army. It's the field army that eventually invaded Okinawa. And this is in mid-1944. And by that point, the war had been going on for 3 years or so. The Army had plenty of high-ranking, battle-hardened, veteran combat commanders that Marshall could have picked to lead that 10th Army. But he didn't pick one of those guys. Instead, he picked this guy named Simon Bolivar Buckner. Okay, whose dad, by the way, is the guy who surrendered Fort Donelson to Ulysses S. Grant in the Civil War. Okay, he picked this Buckner character. Buckner had never heard a shot fired in anger before. Buckner had not served in combat in World War II yet. Okay, but Marshall thought this guy has done well in the stateside assignments. It's not fair to penalize him just because he hasn't seen action yet. He's done well in every other assignment, so he gave Buckner the job of leading the 10th Army in Okinawa in World War II. And again, he didn't have to do that. He could have given it to a battle-hardened combat veteran. A reasonable person would have expected that, but Marshall didn't want to do that. In fact, of these 38 men who led the Army groups and field armies and corps during World War II, 15 deployed them overseas when they hadn't seen any combat in World War II before. 15. That's 15 out of 38. I don't know what percentage that is. I'd need a, computer to figure that out. All right, so that's a third thing he didn't care about. And finally, one last thing that Marshall didn't care about, which you'd think he might, is this. He didn't care about an officer's personality. He cared about the character, but he didn't care about their personality. Marshall understood that you can be a good leader with lots of different kind of personalities. There are outgoing people who are great leaders. There are more introverted people who are great leaders. It goes across the whole spectrum, and Marshall understood that. Now, to be sure, most of these guys who commanded the high-level combat units, they tended to be rather cautious, can-do guys, but that's more a function of the Army's culture than it was really of Marshall's selection process. In fact, Marshall showed a surprising tolerance and affection towards some of the unconventional oddballs that the Army had. He was willing to appoint them to high commands, even though, again, they might be a little strange, a little peculiar. And the classic example of that, of course, is George Patton. Patton, by any definition of the term, was an oddball. He's unconventional, he was strange, and Marshall always had a soft spot for Patton. And it's not just Patton. There are a bunch of other guys who are also kind of strange, who Marshall was willing to give high combat commands to. Terry Allen, who led the 1st Division for a while, for example, is one of them. It's a little off the direct subject, but my favorite story is the commander of the Army Air Force in World War II was Henry Arnold, who was technically a subordinate of Marshall's, but the Army Air Corps did its own thing during the war. And Henry Arnold, one of the things he did is he would get these young officers, a half dozen of them, and their sole job, these promising up-and-coming Army Air Corps officers, their sole job was to be a sounding board for Henry Arnold. So if he woke up in the middle of the night with a great idea, like, I don't know, strapping bombs to bats or whatever, he could call one of these guys up and bounce the idea off of him. And when Marshall heard that, Marshall just sort of rolled his eyes and said, well, it's Henry Arnold. All right, so he didn't care about your personality. Again, you think he might, but he didn't. All right, so Marshall, again, he had his criteria, those 4 that I just gave you, but there is some other stuff that you think that he would care about that he didn't really, as much as you might think. All right, well, obvious question. How do we know that these guys did a good job? Okay, I'm making the argument that Marshall had a great selection process. He picked 38 men who did a great job. How do we know that? Well, let me give you 3 pieces of evidence. Okay, 3 pieces of evidence that these 38 guys did a good job. Well, the first piece of evidence is this, the turnover rate. What do I mean? Of these 38 men who led the Army groups, the field armies, and the Corps in World War II, 14 of them were removed from their jobs before the war was over for one reason or another. That's 14 of the 38 were removed from their jobs. Now that's a third, and you might think that's a lot, but if you look a little closer at the details, you realize that it isn't. Of these 14 guys who lost their jobs during the war, 6 of them were promoted. Okay, guys like Omar Bradley was promoted from Corps to Field Army to Army Group Command. George Patton was promoted from Corps to Army Group Command. So you can't hold it against Marshall because some of these guys were promoted to more responsible positions. 3 of these 38 guys lost their jobs because they fell ill. Okay, they were just too ill for the job. And 1 was killed in combat, and that one guy who was killed in combat was poor Simon Bolivar Buckner, who died at the Battle of Okinawa. So that leaves us with 5 generals who relieved of their, I think they were all Corps commanders, relieved of their Corps command because of perceived failure on the battlefield. But even if you look at that 5, you could make an argument that 4 of the 5 guys who lost their commands, who were relieved of their commands for perceived battlefield failure, it was more for politics and personality conflicts than it was for true incompetence. 2 of the 5 were fired by General Mark Clark in Italy. One was Ernest Dawley, who commanded a corps there, who supposedly failed at Salerno, and the other one was John John Lucas, who commanded the same corps, the 6th Corps at Anzio, and was fired for failing at Anzio. But you can make a good argument that neither of those guys really deserved it. If anybody should have been fired, it should have been Mark Clark, but that's a matter of historical debate. So the fact that two of them lost their jobs under Clark's command, again, I think tells us more about Mark Clark than it tells us about those two guys. The other two were fired by Courtney Hodges, who was the first Army commander in Northwest Europe, and those two guys as well, one of Pete Corlett, who commanded the 19th Corps, the other was John Milliken. You can make an argument that that was more due to personality conflicts and the fact that Courtney Hodges, the Army commander, was just a sour guy who didn't have any sense of proportion. So that leaves us with one guy. There's only one of these 38 guys who, as far as I can tell, the contemporaries thought he deserved to be fired. Historians looking back are almost unanimous that this guy should have been relieved of his command. Only one of the 38. And that one man was Lloyd Fredendall, who commanded the 2nd Corps in North Africa. He was fired right after the Battle of Kasserine Pass. And again, I think there's a historical consensus that that was the right thing to do, that Eisenhower was right to relieve Lloyd Fredendall. Okay, but outside of that, that's the only guy who there's a clear case that almost everybody agrees that was relieved of his command and they think should have been relieved of his command. So that's 1 out of 38. That's not a bad average. Okay, so I think that's one good piece of evidence that Marshall appointed a good group of guys when only 1 of 38 clearly and obviously deserved to be relieved of his command. Right. Well, there's a second piece of evidence that I have, and that is commanders' assessments. Okay, these guys, all 38 of these guys, okay, if you look at their reports during the war, their memos during the war, if you look at their memoirs after the war, they almost all spoke highly of each other. Okay, they almost all respected what each other did, their contributions. Okay, they all thought that they'd done a good job, generally speaking. And again, this might seem commonsensical, but not necessarily. The Union Army won the Civil War, but there's scarcely a battle or campaign in the Civil War where you didn't have Union generals bickering with each other during or after the war. Okay, the Confederacy lost the Civil War, and those guys were bickering all the time after the war. Okay, most wars, okay, it's not unusual to have the generals bickering and fighting each other in the press after the war was over. You don't have much of that during World War II. You have some of that over some people like, say, Mark Clark, okay, but you don't have a lot of that. The big exception in Europe was, of course, Patton. If you read Patton's diary, in the privacy of his diary, he was running everybody down, but that's typical Patton. Okay, he hardly gave anybody credit unless his name was George Patton. In the Pacific, the big exception was Walter Kruger. He was the 6th Army commander, commanded in New Guinea and the Philippines, and by the end of the war, everybody hated Walter Kruger. This guy just had a terrible personality. But there are exceptions. In fact, at the end of the war, Dwight Eisenhower polled his field army command. Be Courtney Hodges of the 1st Army, George Patton of the 3rd Army, Sandy Patch of the 7th Army, and William Simpson of the 9th Army. He polled them, and he said, what do you think of your corps commanders? And each of these 4 guys, they all said the same thing. They all said, I have the best group of corps commanders that any commander could ask for. I have the best corps commanders in the Army. Even Patton said that. And again, Patton didn't like anybody. Okay, even Patton said that. And that tells me that it's a good group of people. Again, when you got a bunch of guys who speak well of each other, that don't bicker as much as you might expect them to, that seems to me a good piece of evidence that they had a pretty good group. And finally, one last piece of evidence that I had that I think, again, is a good piece of evidence that Marshall did a good job is an obvious one. The Army won the war. Okay, they're the winners. So that tells you something. But keep in mind, though, the Army won the war with relatively light casualties in a relatively short amount of time. Okay, sure, I understand that the Americans, I forget what the number is, the total number of American dead in World War II was 405,000. I don't know what it was for the Army, and a lot of those were accidents. But keep in mind, during World War II, the German Army lost over 2 million men killed. The Soviet Army lost over 7 million men killed. Okay, the Army won the war in less than 4 years, suffering a surprisingly small amount of men killed in the war. And there are lots of reasons why the Army won the war. You can't discount material superiority, and we had allies doing a lot of the heavy lifting for us, like the Soviets, and we had intelligence advantage, a morality advantage, a diplomatic advantage. We had all these advantages, but you cannot discount the fact that the quality of American generals was so high. They won the war. That's an obvious piece of evidence. All right, so let me just close with one last story, and it's my favorite Marshall story. I think it tells a lot about the guy. 1952, I guess it was, President Truman asked Marshall to fly to England to represent the United States at Queen Elizabeth's coronation. And I guess they had it at Westminster Abbey, I assume. And Marshall went over there to, again, represent the United States. And there are all these world leaders there, best and brightest in the world, most important people. And Marshall walked into Westminster Abbey. Everybody saw him, and they all stood up out of respect for Marshall. And Marshall, walking in, he saw all these people standing up. And he starts looking around, trying to figure out what important person has just walked in who I should be standing for. And it was for him. Again, there are a lot of, Douglas MacArthur, he would have expected people to stand up for him, but not George Marshall. And I think that tells a lot about this guy. And again, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I do think that Marshall, second only to Washington, greatest general this country's ever had for all sorts of reasons, again, including the selection of these combat commanders. I'd be happy to answer any questions that any of you have.